or something that just gives us a sense that even though we don't understand it, even though we can't necessarily accept it all today, it is a part of who we are. Sometimes we get lost in a story. Joy Richardson and others note that a part of what draws us into story is the promise of finding a different world, finding another time, finding ourselves, and in the best and most important stories, finding God, a sense of the divine that is throughout fiction and nonfiction alike, throughout the stories of our lives. There's something innate within the hungers for a story. Elie Wiesel, who is, of course, was a writer, Holocaust survivor, activist, says that God created us because God loves stories. I like that. When Christ came in the fullness of time, the story goes, he came as the Word made flesh. Many have described it as a story in motion. Christ came as a story in motion. And he went into the world with stories on his lips, weaving them everywhere he went. Aren't those the stories often that we most readily remember and relate to the Bible? Those stories that Jesus told, those parables. A sower went to sow. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers. There was a man who had 2 sons. Hear this story from Joy Richardson, whom I quoted earlier. In the rural township she grew up in, Joy's family attended what she describes as a less important Methodist church, which had a congregation of about 60 people. It was there that Joy was nurtured in the faith by those faithful. Not many of them, and again, in her recollection, not necessarily the youthful ones. She talks about the ancient pastors who were in their last appointment, Ancient pastors who had old things to say, but who again were there. And she says, though, in recollection, sometimes because of ill health weren't even able to fulfill out their contract, but were there and did the job. And then she and her friends would make fun of the ancient Sunday school teachers. These are her words, not mine. The ancient Sunday school teachers and their ways of doing things. Each week, faithfully and patiently, teaching them about faith and story. She says, she admits in hindsight, I was blessed by the very people I had joked about, and now remember with deep thanks and very real humility the many things those wise, caring, and faithful people shared and lived out as they sought to teach God's message to the children, to God's children. She finishes this recollection by simply stating, I give thanks to God for faithful and patient teachers. And what is it that we remember? It's the story. Sometimes it's the story of our experience of being in the class when so-and-so said so-and-so, or when this happened and so-and-so. But sometimes it's the sense of the story, the truths that are passed on. Sometimes intentionally, and sometimes it's the stuff we pick up along the way, never necessarily said, but noticed, paying attention to how people live and what they do. Those are the stories that carry through. Those are the stories we remember, no matter how long chronologically it's been since they happened. Professor Walter Brueggemann, whose books line my study, in his book entitled Worship in Ancient Israel, An Essential Guide, I know that's one you'll want to pick up, right, on your Christmas list? Well, since you probably won't, let me tell you what it says. Israel's primal utterance in worship is an act of remembering that is implicitly an act of hope. In such utterance, Israel anticipates that the future will feature more of the decisive, transformative goodness of God than Israel has known in the past. And the psalmist tells of story. Generations ahead that will know these stories of God and the importance of passing them along. The importance of story. Even to the unborn they will hear of these words of God. And even with millennia of worshiping God and collecting knowledge and experience and countless people before us, we still have to make a personal choice, you and I, about accepting or rejecting the God who created us and who loves us. That's still part of our story. It's still something that we are actively doing each and every time we make a decision. Sure, we have many of us given our lives to Christ. Sure, we have a sense of grace in our lives that surpasses all understanding. Sure, we know that the truth of that means that in this life and the next and the things known and unknown that we have God and God has us. But we make decisions, you and I, each and every time toward the story we're telling. The words we mean to say and the things that people pick up that we never realize we utter. We continue the story. Ancient Israel accepted and acted upon the importance of God's command for them, to teach them to their children so the next generation might know them, even the children not yet born, and that they in turn will teach their own children. So each generation should set its hope anew on God. Things that Israel can't even see or know, but has the faith to know that God's story will continue. We have the perspective of the rest of the story, at least to our point. We know the story's still being told, but we know things, we've experienced things that those who wrote in the Psalms did not experience but believed or hoped, trusted. In Psalm 78, the author writes, "We will not hide them from their children," these stories. And perhaps that's where the power of a true good story lies, that it reveals something and someone that we need to know. So, I ask, what are the stories that you're listening to? What are the stories that you're telling? How do you attend to your own stories? How might God be inviting you to look at your story with new eyes? How do we turn into the better stories that we're telling? One more story today I want to share with you. 4 years ago, I wore this bow tie to a church service. Some of you have heard this story before, some of you haven't. But at the end of the election 4 years ago, prior to election day, prior to the result, the church that I was serving at the time had planned a service of reconciliation. Again, I've told some of you about this before. It was to be the Wednesday after the Tuesday of the election. Regardless of the result, we didn't know who was going to win the election. But regardless of the result, we were going to provide a place for people to come together and focus on the things that story is telling us to do, which is to find the better parts of one another, to find the things that we have in common and work together for a goal. And 4 years ago, I wore this bow tie. It's purple. It's a blending of red and blue. Because that is where I felt the stories that I was reading, the better stories from our Bible, the better stories from our experience were taking us to be. And in that service, that night, that Wednesday night, it's a good thing it wasn't like this year. We would have had to postpone it a week, to know exactly what the result would be. I guess that was on faith. I didn't think about the fact that it could be counting and counting, right? But it worked out then. And in that particular service, I don't know the makeup of the people there. I could tell by the emotion in the room what I would surmise it to be. Looking out, and then considering all of you who are hopefully now on Facebook watching, I would say numerically half are one way, half voted the other. Now, of course, in reality, that number may be very different, considering each and every individual who are actually here. So in a sense, that's something that makes us stop and pause to realize the ways that we need to continue to work together. Part of this that I'm saying is sermon, part of it is prayer, some of it is a little bit of both. Because again, we go back into the Psalms, we go back into other parts of the Bible, and what we see Christ telling us to do, what we see the arc of God's story taking us to Christ and now into a sense of where we are today, is this. Find the parts of people that you can work with. Find the places where you disagree, and even if you disagree, continue to work towards something that is hopeful, something that is true. That was my message 4 years ago. It's my message today. No, wait a minute. It's not my message at all. It's not my message. It's above my pay grade. What I'm seeing here is this. So I ask again, what are the stories that we're listening to? What are the stories that we're telling? How do we attend to our own stories? How might God be inviting us to look at our story with new eyes? And this, how do you and I turn into the better stories that we're telling when we sing the hymns, when we read the scriptures, these stories? How are we turning into the stories that we're telling? And maybe we all have some work to do on that. But I know we can. I have hope for the future. I continue to have hope for our future. I continue to have a sense of knowing that God is still at work, that God's not finished with us yet, that God has things for us to do. A pandemic is still out there, right? Ravaging. We still have people looking for jobs, not knowing where to find them. There is today a storm heading toward the shorelines of people who need hope and help. There are so many things that we have or should have in our common sense of knowledge and hope and action. How do we turn into the better stories that we're telling? I certainly am glad that you've joined us this morning, however you have joined us this morning. I'll ask now as we prepare for our benediction, if we have our ushers to come forward, those of you who are able to stand, please do so. We leave this place, or if we're at home or listening from other places, we leave those places to tell our stories to write our stories, to rewrite our stories, to learn from our stories. All of those parts of story. The psalmist says, generation to generation, we're telling them. We're telling our stories. Whether intentional or unintentional, we're telling them. We're called to tell them. We're called to tell of the better things. We're called to rewrite and write over and do things in a way that ourselves, individually and corporately, will show our love, our allegiance, and our calling to God, the author of our stories. The author of our story. So as we go from this place today, may the road rise to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face and the rain fall gently upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God cradle you in the palm of God's hand. Go now in peace. Amen.
What was the middle one? How beautiful. Thank you. Let me go speak to Carol and I'll come back and talk to you some stuff if you have time. Okay. Just so frightened about that CD. The cues were just so awesome.